Welcome to Life Stories, where we share real, heartfelt tales of unexpected connections, profound losses, and the power of resilience. Today's story follows Olivia, a single mother on a flight to a new life with her daughters Sophie and William. A man carrying the weight of a heartbreaking past. When their worlds collide at 35,000 feet. Their shared pain and quiet understanding will lead to a life-changing revelation. Join us as we explore the surprising ways life can bring healing and hope when we least expect it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and begin today's story with us. The evening air was chilly as I walked into the airport with Sophie in my arms. Her tiny body wrapped snugly in a light blue blanket. She had fallen asleep just before we arrived, her tiny chest rising and falling in that peaceful rhythm that made my heart ache with love. But I knew that peace wouldn't last. We were about to board a plane, and I had a sinking feeling that the turbulence would be more than just a few bumps in the air. I had saved every penny for months, scraping together the money to buy tickets for this flight. It wasn't just any flight, it was my chance. A chance for Sophie and me to escape the cramped, cold apartment in Queens and start anew in Los Angeles. My aunt owned a small Italian restaurant there, and she had offered me a job. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to pay rent without worrying if we could make ends meet. Enough for Sophie to have a better life than I had. But as I walked through the crowded airport, I couldn't help but feel out of place. My worn jeans and faded shirt, clothes I had bought secondhand from the charity shop, stood in sharp contrast to the business suits and designer luggage around me. I could feel the judgment in the air, even though no one said a word. I had learned a long time ago that people like me didn't belong in spaces like this. Please, Sophie, please be good for Mommy, I whispered, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead as I felt the weight of the world bearing down on me. She stirred slightly but stayed peaceful, her small fingers curling around the brass locket I wore around my neck. Inside it was the only photo I had of Sophie's father, a photo that I had clung to for months after he disappeared. The day I told him I was pregnant, he slammed the door behind him and never came back. The memory still stung. It was a wound that hadn't healed, and I didn't know if it ever would. I had spent 6 months working double shifts at the diner, scraping together every last tip to afford these tickets. I had even gone to bed hungry some nights, knowing that every penny I saved was a step toward this moment. This flight, this chance, I couldn't afford for anything to go wrong. As I made my way down the narrow aisle of the plane, I felt the stares of the passengers. I couldn't help but notice their disapproving glances, businessmen in sharp suits. Businessmen who probably made in an hour what I earned in a week. And here I was, struggling to make ends meet, holding my daughter, a simple woman with dreams bigger than I had any right to dream. When I finally reached my seat in row 23, I was grateful to see that the aisle seat was empty. I settled into the middle seat, carefully placing Sophie on my lap. I glanced to my left, where a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit sat, his eyes briefly meeting mine as he shifted his briefcase aside. He looked at me for a moment, and I felt my cheeks flush. I could see the way his eyes lingered on my threadbare sweater and the coffee stains on my sleeve. And I braced myself for the inevitable. He would judge me. I knew it. But then, to my surprise, the man spoke, his voice kind and soft. "Let me help you with that," he said, before I could even ask. I blinked in surprise as he stood and effortlessly lifted my carry-on, stowing it in the overhead compartment. I had expected him to look at me with the same distaste I had become so used to. But instead, there was only warmth in his expression. He gave me a quick, reassuring smile as he sat back down, his expensive watch glinting in the overhead light. "Thank you," I managed, settling into my seat with Sophie nestled in my arms. I couldn't help but notice how out of place I felt next to him. His appearance, polished, elegant, was so far removed from mine. I felt awkward, self-conscious. The contrast between his sleek suit and my worn clothes made me acutely aware of the disparity between our worlds. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, their voices muffled by the low hum of the engines. Sophie remained surprisingly calm, her little fingers grasping the safety card I had handed her as a makeshift toy. I couldn't afford to buy her anything new this month, And this simple piece of paper had to do. As the plane began its ascent and the engines roared to life, my heart rate increased. This was it. This flight represented everything I had worked for. The new job, the better life, the hope that I could finally provide Sophie with the stability she deserved. But just as the plane lifted off the ground, Sophie's lower lip began to tremble. No, not now. I reached for the pacifier in my pocket. But I was too late. Sophie let out the first wail, piercing the stillness of the cabin. And I felt my stomach drop. I'm so sorry, I whispered desperately, bouncing her gently in my lap, fumbling through my bag for the bottle of formula I had rationed for the flight. The crying intensified, echoing through the cabin. I could feel the eyes of the other passengers on me, their annoyed expressions cutting through me like knives. A businessman in front of us sighed loudly, pulling his headphones over his ears. A woman across the aisle shot me a disapproving glare, muttering something about irresponsible mothers under her breath. Tears of frustration began to well in my eyes. I tried everything, different positions, soft singing, offering the bottle, but nothing worked. I could hear the pressure in Sophie's little ears as the plane climbed higher. And I felt completely helpless. I wanted to comfort her, to make it better, but I couldn't. Each passing moment felt like an eternity. The judgment in the air was suffocating. I had grown used to it. The looks I got at the grocery store when I had to put items back because my card was declined. The stares when I begged the clinic for a payment plan for Sophie's vaccinations. The whispers when I brought Sophie to work because I couldn't afford a babysitter. Being a single mother at 24 wasn't what I had planned for my life. But it was my reality. And I was doing the best I could. Even if the world seemed determined to remind me that my best wasn't good enough. I could feel the weight of every stare, every judgmental glance. As Sophie's cries echoed through the cabin, my heart raced as I tried everything I could think of. But nothing seemed to soothe her. I felt a lump form in my throat. And for the first time in months, I could feel the overwhelming exhaustion creeping in. The overwhelming sensation that no matter how hard I tried, I was just never enough. But then something unexpected happened. The man sitting beside me, the one with the perfectly pressed suit and the polished shoes, shifted in his seat. His face was unreadable as he turned toward me. And for a moment, I braced myself for more judgment. But instead, his voice, low and soothing, cut through the air. "May I?" he asked softly. His words almost lost beneath the sound of Sophie's wailing. Before I could even respond, he leaned closer and began whispering in a gentle, melodic tone. I froze, stunned by how easily the soft rhythm of his voice seemed to cut through the chaos of Sophie's cries. The sudden calm that descended on my daughter felt almost magical. Sophie's crying started to subside, her sobs gradually fading into hiccups as she stared at the stranger with wide eyes. It was as though a switch had been flipped. And for the first time since we boarded the plane, I could breathe again. I turned to him, blinking in disbelief. How had he done that? It was as though he had a magic touch, a calming presence I couldn't comprehend. Sophie had never reacted like this with anyone else. I had tried every trick in the book, bouncing her, singing to her, but nothing had worked. Yet here this man was, effortlessly calming her in a way I couldn't even understand. How did you? I began to ask, but my words caught in my throat as I noticed a flicker of something in his eyes. A brief flash of sadness, before he quickly masked it with a smile. It always works, he replied softly, his fingers absent-mindedly turning the wedding ring on his left hand. My daughter used to cry the same way. I didn't know why, but I could see the pain in his expression. Even though it was fleeting, it was there for just a moment. A raw, unguarded emotion that he quickly concealed. I felt a pang of empathy, sensing that this man had a story he wasn't ready to share. But the sorrow in his eyes spoke volumes. His words lingered in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder who this man was, what he had been through. My name's William, he said after a brief silence, his tone warm, though there was something distant about it. William Harrison. Olivia, I replied softly, still in a bit of shock, trying to process what had just happened. Olivia Johnson, and this is Sophie. His eyes softened as he looked at Sophie, who had now settled in my arms. still gazing curiously at the man who had calmed her so quickly. "She's beautiful," William said, his voice laced with a tenderness I hadn't expected. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on Sophie's tiny face. But his smile faltered slightly when he looked at me again. "How old is she?" he asked, his voice quiet, as though he was afraid to disturb the fragile peace between us. "She's 6 months," I said, still processing the sudden calm that had fallen over Sophie. It felt like a small miracle, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person this man was. He had a warmth about him that I hadn't encountered often in my life. 6 months, he repeated, his voice trailing off. He looked at me with a strange expression, part sadness, part something else, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed lost in his thoughts for a moment, and I almost didn't notice when Sophie, still nestled comfortably in my arms, reached her little hand toward him. Without thinking, I found myself asking, "Would you like to hold her?" The question seemed to surprise him, and for a brief moment, I thought I might have crossed a boundary. But then, after a slight pause, he nodded carefully, his eyes softening. "Sure," he said, his voice gentle. He accepted Sophie into his arms with an ease that told me he was no stranger to holding babies. As he cradled her, I noticed his wedding ring again, the same one that had caught the cabin's fluorescent lights earlier. There was something about him, something in the way he held Sophie that made me wonder if he had experience with loss, with pain, that he wasn't ready to talk about. As the plane leveled off and we hit cruising altitude, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to William Harrison than met the eye. The way he held Sophie, the shadow that crossed his face when he looked at her, and the wedding ring that seemed to carry its own weight, everything hinted at something deeper. Something painful, but for now, we shared this brief moment of peace, the quiet lull of the plane, and the bond we were beginning to form. However unlikely it seemed, little did I know, this flight would change both of our lives in ways we couldn't have possibly imagined. The next hour passed in a strange kind of peace. Sophie was now asleep in William's arms, her tiny hand gently holding onto his finger, her breath soft and steady. I couldn't help but watch them, struck by how natural it all seemed. Here was this man, a stranger, and yet, with Sophie nestled against him, he looked like a father, like someone who belonged in the role. His steady breathing, the way he rocked her gently to keep her comfortable, it was all so familiar, yet foreign at the same time. I was lost in my thoughts when William shifted in his seat, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the armrest. After a moment of silence, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. There was a tension in his eyes now, a sharpness that hadn't been there earlier. "You're very good with her," I said softly, breaking the stillness. "I usually can't get her to sleep without walking her for hours." William gave me a small smile, but there was something in the way he looked at Sophie, a deep sorrow that flickered in his eyes. "She's fine," he replied, his voice quiet, almost distant. "My daughter," he trailed off, his words lost in the air between us. There was a painful pause before he continued, his voice tighter now, as though the words hurt to say. "My daughter would have been 4 this March," he said, the pain in his voice unmistakable. "Her name was Lily." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could see it in his eyes, the way his whole body seemed to tighten at the mention of her name. A wave of empathy washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of sorrow. I couldn't even imagine the pain he must have felt. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. It was all I could say, but it felt inadequate. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," William interrupted gently, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly around Sophie. "It was 3 years ago. A rainy night, a drunk driver, a red light he didn't see." His words were measured, calm, but I could hear the ache in them. "I lost both Lily and my wife, Catherine, that night." My breath caught in my throat as his story unfolded. I couldn't even begin to fathom what he had gone through, losing everything in the blink of an eye. Here I was, worried about rent, about putting food on the table for Sophie, and this man, this stranger, had experienced a loss so deep, so devastating, that it made my own struggles seem small in comparison. "That's terrible," I breathed, my heart breaking for him. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. William didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at Sophie. Her peaceful face now relaxed in his arms. Her tiny fingers still clutching his. I watched him, unsure of what to say. As he continued, his voice distant. Neither could I, he said quietly. Until it happened, I was working late at the firm. Catherine was picking Lily up from her grandmother's house. They were only 10 minutes from home. He swallowed hard, his fingers absently tracing Sophie's hand. I keep thinking, if I had just left work on time that day. If I'd been the one to pick her up. His voice faltered, and I could see the pain in his eyes. The guilt that still lingered. You can't think that way, I said softly, my hand reaching out instinctively. I quickly pulled it back, self-conscious about the contrast between his fine wool suit and my worn sweater. But the impulse to comfort him was strong. You can't blame yourself. William sighed, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. I know, he said, his voice raw with emotion. My therapist says the same thing. But it's hard not to. Especially on nights like this. He looked at Sophie again, his eyes softening. She reminds me so much of Lily at this age. He added, his voice barely a whisper. The same curious eyes, the same way of grabbing fingers. I was at a loss for words. I could feel the weight of his grief in the air between us. And it was overwhelming. I had always known loss. But never in the way he had. Yet, somehow, I found myself understanding the depth of his pain. As if it had woven itself into my own heart. We were two broken souls. Sitting on a plane. Connected by the weight of our pasts and the hope that we could move forward. The flight attendants passed by. Their cart offering drinks and snacks. But neither of us seemed to notice. I felt the silence between us grow heavier. Laden with stories untold and emotions that had been buried too long. Finally, after a few more moments of quiet, William shifted slightly in his seat. I've been thinking about something, he said, his voice soft but steady. If you don't mind me asking, what about Emma's father? My fingers instinctively went to the locket around my neck. The one I never took off. The bitterness that had been creeping into my voice for months resurfaced. And I quickly tamped it down. He's not in the picture, I said quietly, the familiar edge in my voice. The moment I told him I was pregnant. He told me it was my problem to deal with. I haven't heard from him since. William nodded, as though he understood. His loss, he said with quiet conviction. I can see it in how Sophie looks at you. She feels secure with you. His words, though simple, hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't perfect, far from it, but I had done my best for Sophie. And somewhere along the way, I had learned to be strong. Even when it felt impossible. You're doing an amazing job. William continued, his green eyes meeting mine with unexpected intensity. I can see it in the way she looks at you. You're doing the best you can. And that counts for a lot. I didn't know how to respond. His words were so kind. So genuine, and for a moment, I felt a warmth that I hadn't realized I had been missing. Maybe it wasn't about the money or the job I was chasing, it was about being seen. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone truly saw me. Not for my worn clothes or my worn-out life, but for the mother I was trying to be. Thank you, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying. As the plane descended toward San Francisco, a quiet understanding settled between us. William and I had shared our stories, our pains, and for the first time, I didn't feel so alone. The weight of his grief was heavy. But in that moment, it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a bond. The turbulence had passed, and now, as we prepared to land, I realized that this journey wasn't just about the fresh start I had hoped for, but also about the unexpected connections we make when we least expect them. When the plane touched down, it wasn't just the city of San Francisco I was stepping into. It was a new chapter, one where I wasn't walking alone. William, with all his pain and kindness, had become part of our story, Sophie's and mine. As we walked through the terminal, our footsteps synchronized. I knew that life was about to offer me more than I could have ever imagined. The inheritance, the job at Bella Maria's. It was all just part of the journey. But the real treasure lay in the relationships we build along the way. The ones that heal us and make us whole. As we made our way out of the airport, Sophie's small hand wrapped around William's finger. I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope rising in my chest. Maybe life didn't always go according to plan. But sometimes, the most beautiful things come when we least expect them. If you'd like to hear more stories that inspire, touch your heart, and bring you hope, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for the next video from Life Stories.